The moment her husband spat on her at the family dinner, Claire Donovan didn't flinch, but his mistress, Jessica, laughed like she'd already won. What neither of them knew was that Claire owned the hospital where his parents had worked their entire lives, the same hospital that kept their family afloat through every crisis, every surgery, every desperate night. The spit dripped down Claire's cheek as her in-laws watched in horror, their son transforming into a stranger before their eyes, but Claire stayed silent. She could have told them right then, could have revealed that she held the keys to everything they'd ever built, everything they still needed, but she didn't. Because what she did next didn't just crush her husband Marcus and his mistress, it shattered them in ways they would never recover from. And the question burning in everyone's mind was this: how does a woman who's been publicly humiliated at her own family dinner hold enough power to destroy the people who betrayed her? And what kind of devastating secret had she been carrying all along that even her husband's parents never suspected? Claire Donovan had learned to read silence the way sailors read storms, and tonight the silence in her dining room was a Category 5. She stood at the mahogany table she'd inherited from her grandmother, adjusting the placement of the wine glasses for the third time, each movement precise and deliberate. The chandelier above cast prismatic shadows across the cream-colored walls, and she could hear her husband Marcus's car pulling into the driveway 30 minutes late. Through the window, she watched him emerge from the driver's side, then walk around to open the passenger door for someone who definitely wasn't his mother. The woman who stepped out wore a dress cut low enough to make October seem irrelevant, her blonde hair catching the porch light like spun gold. Claire's hands stilled on the wine glass she'd been holding, her reflection ghosting across its crystal surface. She'd suspected for 6 months now, ever since Marcus had started pronouncing certain words differently, as if he were trying on a new personality the way some men tried on expensive watches. The late nights at the office, the sudden interest in cologne that cost more than their monthly grocery bill, the way he'd stopped touching her casually, those absent-minded caresses that had once been as natural as breathing. Marcus's parents, Donald and Patricia Hensley, were already seated at the table, their faces arranged in careful neutrality that spoke volumes. Donald's weathered hands gripped his napkin like it might anchor him through whatever storm was approaching, and Patricia kept glancing between Claire and the front door with an expression that managed to be both apologetic and terrified. They were good people, solid people, the kind who'd spent their entire lives in service to others. Donald had worked 40 years as a nurse at Riverside Medical Center, handling everything from gunshot wounds to premature babies with the same steady competence. Patricia had been a surgical technician for 37 years before retiring last spring, her hands so skilled that surgeons had requested her specifically for the most delicate procedures. The front door opened, and Marcus's voice carried down the hallway with a forced cheerfulness that made Claire's stomach turn. "Sorry we're late, everyone. Traffic was insane." He appeared in the doorway with his hand possessively gripping the small of the blonde woman's back, and the smile on his face was one Claire had never seen before. Triumphant, reckless, like a man who decided to burn his life down just to feel the heat. "Everyone, this is Jessica. She's my colleague." The word colleague hung in the air like smoke from a fire nobody wanted to acknowledge. Patricia's fork clattered against her plate, the sound sharp enough to make everyone except Claire jump. Claire simply folded her napkin across her lap with the same practiced precision she brought to everything, the gesture so familiar it had become automatic. She'd been married to Marcus for 8 years, together for 10, and she'd spent most of that time trying to decode the man she'd thought she loved, searching for the person beneath the surface who might actually see her. Jessica slid into the seat beside Marcus, directly across from Claire, and smiled with teeth so white they could have been in a toothpaste commercial. "I've heard so much about you all," she said, her voice syrupy and deliberate, each word carefully weighted. "Marcus talks about his family constantly. It's like I already know you." Claire noticed the way Jessica emphasized his family, as if she were already rewriting the pronouns, already editing Claire out of the narrative like an unwanted character in a story that was still being written. She thought about her grandmother, who taught her that grace was a weapon and silence was armor, who'd built an empire from nothing and then hidden it behind charitable foundations and anonymous donations because she believed the work mattered more than the credit. Claire had inherited more than just money and property from Margaret Donovan. She'd inherited a philosophy about power, about how the most dangerous people were the ones nobody saw coming. Donald cleared his throat, the sound rough and uncertain. "Claire made the roast," he said quietly, his eyes flickering between his son and his daughter-in-law, like he was watching a car accident in slow motion. "She's been cooking since noon. That recipe was Patricia's mother's, passed down 3 generations." "I'm vegan," Jessica announced, not looking at Claire. Her gaze fixed on Marcus like he was the only person in the room who mattered. "But that's okay. I'll just have the salad. I'm sure it's fine." Claire stood and began serving, moving through the motions with the kind of muscle memory that came from years of hosting dinners, charity events, board meetings disguised as social gatherings. Nobody at this table except her grandmother, dead now for 5 years, had ever known the full extent of the Donovan family legacy. Claire's maiden name carried weight in certain circles, the kind of weight that could move mountains or raise them entirely, that could save hospitals or shut them down, that could make careers or destroy them with a single phone call. But she'd never been one to wave her privilege like a flag or use it as a weapon unless absolutely necessary. When she'd married Marcus Hensley, a middle-class accountant from a family of medical professionals, she'd simply been Claire, not Claire Donovan of the Donovan Holdings empire that controlled everything from real estate to healthcare facilities across 6 states. She'd wanted to be loved for who she was, not what she had, and Marcus had seemed perfect, stable, kind, uncomplicated. Except he hadn't been any of those things, not really. He'd been a man wearing a mask, and now that mask was slipping, revealing something underneath that made her wonder if she'd ever known him at all. The first course was butternut squash soup, and Claire watched Jessica take a careful sip before setting down her spoon with a small grimace. Marcus drank wine, more than usual, his movements becoming loose and careless as the alcohol soaked into his bloodstream. Patricia barely touched her food, her eyes red-rimmed like she'd been crying before they arrived, and Donald kept looking at his son with an expression that managed to be both heartbroken and furious. They'd raised Marcus to be better than this, Claire knew. They'd taught him about commitment and honor and treating people with basic human decency. Watching him unravel must have felt like watching a building they'd spent decades constructing suddenly collapse, all their careful work reduced to rubble. Marcus poured himself another glass of wine, the bottle clinking against the crystal with a sound that seemed too loud in the heavy silence. Claire served the main course, the roast that she'd spent hours preparing, basted and seasoned exactly the way Patricia had taught her during their first Christmas together. She remembered that day clearly, Patricia in her kitchen, patient and kind, showing Claire how to tie the roast properly, how to time everything so it all came out perfect. "Cooking is love made visible," Patricia had said, and Claire had believed her, had spent years trying to show Marcus love through food and gestures and the 1,000 small kindnesses that made up a marriage. "You know what your problem is, Claire?" Marcus said suddenly, his words starting to slur at the edges, his finger jabbing across the table like a weapon. "You're cold. You're like a goddamn ice sculpture. Beautiful but untouchable. Jessica here, she's warm, she's alive. She makes me feel like I'm actually living instead of just existing in this museum you call a home." The words landed like blows, each one carefully aimed to cause maximum damage. Claire set down her fork with a soft click that somehow carried more weight than if she'd slammed it down. She'd practiced this moment in her mind 1,000 times, rehearsed what she might say when the inevitable confrontation arrived. But nothing had prepared her for the casual cruelty in her husband's eyes. The way he looked at her, like she was an obstacle to be removed, rather than a person he'd once promised to cherish until death. Donald's voice cut through the tension like a blade. "Marcus, that's enough." His weathered face had gone pale, the kind of pale that came from witnessing something fundamentally wrong, something that violated the basic laws of human decency. "Son, I don't know what's gotten into you, but this stops right now." But Marcus wasn't finished, wasn't even close to finished. He stood up, swaying slightly, and Jessica placed a hand on his arm that looked like comfort, but read like ownership. like she was a puppeteer pulling strings on a marionette who'd forgotten he was made of wood. No, Dad, they need to hear this. All of it. I've been living in a mausoleum for 8 years, trapped in this perfect house with this perfect wife who never shows any emotion, who never wants to actually live. He gestured around the dining room with its antique furniture and original artwork, its Persian rugs and floor-to-ceiling bookshelves. Claire inherited all this money, this house, everything handed to her on a silver platter, and she just sits in it like some kind of queen, counting her gold while I work myself to death trying to provide for us. Claire felt something shift inside her chest, a tectonic plate grinding against another, building pressure that would eventually have to release. She thought about the nights she'd waited up for Marcus, the dinners that had gone cold, the anniversary he'd forgotten because he was too busy at work. She thought about the baby she'd wanted, the one they'd discussed before they got married, how Marcus had said they should wait until his career was more established, until they had more saved, until the timing was right. The timing had never been right, and now she understood why. He'd been planning his exit for longer than she'd realized. I wanted children, she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper, but somehow filling the entire room. You said we should wait. You said you needed to focus on your career first, that we had plenty of time. Because you were always working, Marcus shot back, his face flushed with wine and anger, and something that looked almost like panic, like he was realizing he'd started something he couldn't control. Always at those mysterious meetings, always flying off to God knows where for business you never explained. What was I supposed to think? That you actually wanted a family when you were never even here? Jessica leaned forward, her expression dripping with false sympathy, her voice honeyed and poisonous. It must be so hard, she cooed, her eyes locked on Claire with an intensity that was almost predatory. Keeping a man interested when you're more focused on spreadsheets than your marriage, when you're more concerned with your precious career than actually being a wife. Patricia made a small sound, something between a gasp and a sob, her hand flying to her throat like she was trying to hold back words that wanted to escape. She'd welcomed Claire into their family with open arms, had treated her like the daughter she'd never had spent countless afternoons teaching her family recipes and sharing stories about Marcus's childhood. This must have been destroying her, watching her son transform into someone unrecognizable, someone cruel. Claire remembered the first time she'd met Patricia, 3 months into dating Marcus. They'd gone to Donald and Patricia's modest ranch house for Sunday dinner, and Patricia had pulled Claire aside while the men were watching football. My son has never looked at anyone the way he looks at you, Patricia had said, squeezing Claire's hand. I can see he's found something special. Claire had believed her then, had trusted in that assessment, had built her entire future around the idea that Marcus Hensley saw something in her worth keeping. Marcus, please, Patricia whispered now, tears streaming down her face, her voice breaking. This isn't you. This isn't how we raised you. Your father and I taught you better than this. But Marcus was beyond listening, beyond reaching. The wine had unlocked something in him, some resentment he'd been storing up for years, and now it was pouring out like poison from a cracked bottle. He walked around the table, his footsteps heavy and deliberate, and Claire could smell the alcohol on his breath, see the muscles in his jaw working like he was chewing on words he couldn't quite swallow. When he spat on her, the warm wetness hitting her cheek just below her left eye, the world seemed to stop rotating. The grandfather clock in the corner halted mid-tick. The chandelier stopped swaying. Even the October wind outside the windows held its breath, as if nature itself was shocked by what had just occurred. The spit dripped down Claire's face slowly, and she didn't move, didn't react, just sat there with a stillness that was more terrifying than any scream could have been. Jessica laughed. It was a high, tinkling sound, like breaking glass trying to pretend it was music, like someone who just won a prize they'd been competing for. Oh my God, she gasped between giggles, her hand covering her mouth in mock horror. You actually did it. You told me you wanted to, but I didn't think you'd have the balls to actually... Donald stood up so fast his chair toppled backward, hitting the floor with a crash that made everyone jump. His face had gone from pale to red, a vein pulsing in his temple that Claire had never seen before. Get out, he said, his voice shaking with rage and grief, and something deeper, something primal. Both of you, get out of this house right now. I don't care where you go, but you're not staying here another second. But Claire raised one hand, palm out, and her father-in-law froze mid-step. There was something in her expression now, something that hadn't been there before. A kind of terrible calm, like the eye of a hurricane realizing it had been waiting its entire existence for exactly this moment. She reached up and wiped the spit from her face with her napkin, her movements slow and deliberate. And when she looked up at Marcus, her eyes were dry, but somehow more devastating than if she'd been crying. The napkin fell from her hand onto the table, landing next to her untouched plate. Claire stood up slowly, her chair scraping against the hardwood floor, and suddenly she seemed taller than her 5'5" frame, seemed to occupy more space than the room wanted to give her. Marcus took an involuntary step backward, some ancient instinct recognizing danger, even if his conscious mind hadn't caught up yet. "Do you remember?" Claire said softly, each word carefully enunciated. "When your mother got sick 3 years ago? The pneumonia that turned into sepsis, that nearly killed her?" Patricia's hand flew to her throat, her eyes widening. It had been the worst month of their lives. Donald sleeping in hospital chairs for 2 weeks straight. Marcus flying back from a business conference in Denver. All of them certain they were going to lose her. Claire had been there too, bringing coffee and sandwiches, sitting with Donald during the long nights when Patricia was unconscious and they didn't know if she'd wake up. But then things had shifted mysteriously. Patricia had been moved to a private room, received experimental treatments not typically covered by insurance, had specialists consulting on her case around the clock. They'd called it a miracle, the way she'd recovered, how she'd gone from death's door to walking out of the hospital within 3 weeks. "And Dad," Claire continued, her gaze shifting to Donald, and there was something in her eyes now that made him sink back into his chair. "When you needed that spinal surgery last year, the one for the herniated discs that were making it impossible for you to work, the surgery that had a 6-month waiting list, but somehow you got in the next week with the best neurosurgeon in the state?" Donald's face went very still, his weathered hands gripping the edge of the table. Marcus looked between his parents and his wife, something like understanding beginning to dawn behind his wine-clouded eyes. But it was too slow, too late, like watching someone realize they'd stepped off a cliff only after they'd already left the ground and gravity had taken hold. Jessica's laughter had died completely, her face cycling through expressions like a slot machine, landing on different emotions. Confusion, calculation, something that might have been fear. "I don't understand," she said, her voice losing its earlier confidence. "What does any of this have to do with—" "Riverside Medical Center," Claire said. And her voice was quiet, but it filled the room like thunder, like a truth that had been waiting years to be spoken. The hospital where Donald and Patricia dedicated their entire lives. The hospital that employed 400 people in this county, that served 3 counties total. That was the only level 2 trauma center within 50 miles. She paused, letting the words settle like sediment in still water. The hospital that was going bankrupt 6 years ago, that was going to be bought out by MedCorp International, a corporation that would have gutted it, laid off 2/3 of the staff, and turned half the building into luxury condos. The color drained from Marcus's face so fast Claire thought he might actually faint, his hand reaching out to grip the back of his chair for support. Patricia stood up slowly, her hands shaking, gripping the edge of the table like it was the only solid thing in a world that had suddenly become liquid and unstable. Claire could see her mind working backward through years of small miracles and impossible conveniences. Every time the hospital had bent over backward for the Hensley family, every door that had opened when it should have been locked. "I bought it," Claire said simply. "I saved it." Donovan Holdings purchased Riverside Medical Center 6 years ago through a subsidiary, kept it running, invested $40 million in renovations and equipment, ensured that every single employee kept their job and their benefits. She looked at Patricia, then at Donald, and her expression softened slightly. "And I never told anyone, because the work was what mattered, not the credit. Because my grandmother taught me that real power is quiet, that real change happens in boardrooms and legal documents, not in newspaper headlines." Patricia's legs seemed to give out, and she sank back into her chair, her hand over her mouth, tears streaming down her face. "The Donovan Holdings anonymous donor," she whispered, her voice breaking. "The one who's funded the new cancer center, the renovations to the emergency department, the program that provides free health care to uninsured children." That was you?" "It's always been me," Claire confirmed. "My grandmother started Donovan Holdings in 1962, with money she inherited from her father, turned it into one of the largest private healthcare investment firms in the country. When she died, I inherited everything. The company, the properties, the foundations, all of it." She looked at Marcus, and there was something in her eyes that made him flinch. "You asked me once why I had to travel so much for work, why I had so many mysterious meetings. I was running a multi-billion-dollar company, Marcus. I was saving hospitals, funding research, creating jobs. And you never once asked what I actually did, never showed even the slightest interest in my life beyond how it affected yours." Marcus opened his mouth, closed it, tried again. No words came out. He looked like a man who just realized he'd been playing chess while everyone else was playing a completely different game he didn't even know the rules to. Jessica's face had gone pale beneath her makeup, her earlier smugness evaporating like water on hot pavement. Claire pulled her phone from her pocket and set it on the table. Screen up. And the simple gesture somehow carried more menace than if she'd pulled out a weapon. She tapped it once, and a recording began to play, Jessica's voice unmistakable, crystal clear through the phone's speaker. "Once you're divorced, we can access her accounts. You said she keeps everything joint, right? We can drain them before she even knows what's happening. My friend's a lawyer. He can help us move the money offshore if we need to." Jessica's recorded voice was casual, almost cheerful, discussing financial devastation like it was a weekend shopping trip. Marcus's voice joined in, slightly muffled but still clear. "She's so desperate to keep me, it's pathetic. If I ask for money, she'll probably just give it to me. Her family's loaded, and she's too proud to admit the marriage is failing. We can take her for everything." Patricia made a sound like she'd been physically struck, her hands coming up to cover her face. Donald's expression had moved beyond anger into something colder, something that looked like grief mixed with disgust. The recording continued, laying out a scheme that involved forged signatures, drained bank accounts, and leaving Claire not just divorced, but financially ruined, homeless, destroyed. Jessica and Marcus discussed it with the casual tone of people ordering takeout, deciding between Chinese and Italian. The recording played for 3 more minutes, each second more damning than the last. They talked about how stupid Claire was, how she never paid attention to finances, how easy it would be to manipulate her. They laughed about the prenup she'd insisted on, not knowing that Marcus had consulted with a lawyer who'd assured him there were ways around it if they were clever enough. They discussed timing, waiting until after Donald's next medical procedure so Claire wouldn't pull funding from the hospital out of spite. When it finally stopped, the silence was absolute, heavy enough to crush diamonds. Claire picked up her phone and slipped it back into her pocket with the same careful precision she brought to everything. "I've had investigators following you both for 3 months, she said, her voice matter-of-fact, like she was discussing the weather. "Private investigators, forensic accountants, cybersecurity experts. I know about the apartment you're renting together downtown, the one with the view of the river. I know about the company credit cards you've been using for personal expenses. Marcus, the jewelry you bought Jessica, the weekends in Miami, all of it." Marcus swayed on his feet, his face cycling through expressions like someone watching their life collapse in real time. Jessica had gone very still. Her earlier animation completely disappeared, replaced by something that looked like a trapped animal calculating escape routes. "And you, Jessica," Claire continued, turning her attention to the other woman for the first time since the recording had played. "I know about the nursing license you falsified 3 years ago, claiming experience you never had at hospitals you never worked at. I know about the medications you've been stealing from your current employer, selling them online. I know about the patient whose death you were partly responsible for in Texas, the one you fled the state to avoid accountability for." Jessica's face went from pale to gray, her mouth opening and closing like a fish drowning in air. "You can't prove any of that," she whispered, but her voice carried no conviction, just desperation. "I can prove everything," Claire said quietly. "I have documentation, witnesses, financial records, everything anyone would need to bury you both so deep you'll never see daylight again." She looked at Marcus, and for just a moment, something flickered in her eyes that might have been pain or might have been pity. "The divorce papers will be filed tomorrow morning. You'll get nothing, Marcus, because the prenup you signed without reading carefully has an infidelity clause with ironclad language written by the best family law attorneys money can buy. Your belongings will be packed and moved to a storage facility by the end of the week. You're not welcome in this house ever again." Marcus finally found his voice, and it came out strangled, desperate, nothing like the confident tone he'd used earlier when he was spitting on his wife and parading his mistress through their home. "Claire, wait. We can talk about this. I was drunk. I wasn't thinking clearly. We can go to counseling. We can work through this." "No," Claire said simply, the word final as a coffin lid closing. "We can't. You didn't just cheat on me, Marcus. You spat on me in front of your parents. You brought your mistress to our family dinner, to this table where we've shared 8 years of meals and memories. You planned to rob me, to leave me with nothing, to humiliate me and destroy me financially." She paused, and when she spoke again, her voice was softer but somehow more cutting. "You looked at me with contempt, like I was garbage you couldn't wait to throw away. That's not something counseling fixes. That's not something you come back from." Donald had been silent throughout the recording, his weathered face showing every one of his 63 years, but now he stood up, moving around the table to stand beside Claire. He didn't touch her, didn't offer empty platitudes, just stood there in solidarity. And the gesture meant more than any words could have. Patricia joined him a moment later, her face streaked with tears, but her jaw set with determination. "Claire, honey," Patricia said, her voice thick with emotion, "I am so sorry. If I had known, if I had any idea what he was doing—" "You have nothing to apologize for," Claire interrupted gently, and the kindness in her voice made Patricia's tears fall faster. "You and Donald have been nothing but wonderful to me. You welcomed me into your family. You treated me like a daughter. You taught me things my own mother never bothered to teach me." She looked at Marcus, and her expression hardened again. "Your son made his choices. Those choices have consequences. But those consequences don't extend to you." Jessica finally moved, standing up so fast her chair tipped backward, hitting the floor with a crash that made everyone jump. Her face was twisted with something ugly now, all pretense of sweetness and sympathy burned away by panic and rage. "You think you're so perfect," she hissed, her carefully modulated voice replaced by something raw and desperate. "You think money fixes everything, that you can just buy your way out of being a cold, frigid bitch who couldn't keep her husband interested." Claire looked at her for a long moment, and there was something in her gaze that made Jessica take an involuntary step backward. "No," Claire said quietly. "I think actions have consequences. I think betrayal leaves scars that never fully heal. I think trust, once broken, can't be glued back together no matter how much you want it to be. And I think you're about to learn that some people are kind not because they're weak, but because they choose to be. And when they stop choosing kindness, when you push them past the point where mercy makes sense, they're more dangerous than you ever imagined." She walked to the sideboard and pulled out a folder, thick with documents, and set it on the table. "These are copies," she said. "The originals are with my lawyers, and with the state medical board, and with the DEA, and with several other agencies that are very interested in your activities, Jessica. Your nursing license will be suspended by the end of the week. You'll be arrested within the month. The patient's family in Texas has been notified that they can pursue legal action now that there's evidence. And every hospital within 3 states will be notified that you're not to be employed in any healthcare capacity." Jessica's face crumpled, her carefully constructed facade finally breaking completely. "You can't do this," she said, but it came out like a question, like a plea. "I'll tell them you're lying, that you fabricated all of this because you're jealous." "The evidence speaks for itself," Claire said calmly. Documentation, timestamps, financial records, witness statements from people you worked with, people you stole from, people you hurt. Your word against reality doesn't end well for you, Jessica. It never does. Marcus was crying now, silent tears running down his face as the full weight of what he'd destroyed settled on his shoulders. Claire remembered the man she'd fallen in love with 10 years ago, the one who'd seemed so different from the wealthy, superficial men her family kept trying to set her up with. Marcus had been genuine, or so she'd thought, working his way up at his accounting firm through actual merit rather than family connections. He'd seemed impressed by her intelligence rather than intimidated by it, had claimed to love her for who she was rather than what she had. But people don't become cruel overnight, Claire had learned. They show you who they are in small ways first. A dismissive comment here, a forgotten promise there, a gradual erosion of respect disguised as comfort. She'd ignored the signs, made excuses, convinced herself that marriage required compromise and patience. She'd been wrong. Marriage required mutual respect, and Marcus had lost his respect for her long before Jessica had entered the picture. I need both of you to leave, Claire said, her voice gentle but inflexible. Donald and Patricia, you're welcome to stay, but your son needs to go. Jessica, you can find your own way home. I've already called a car for you. It's waiting outside. Donald helped Patricia gather her purse, and together they moved toward the hallway. But they didn't follow Marcus toward the door. Instead, they turned back to Claire, and Patricia pulled her into a fierce hug that smelled like lavender and tears. You didn't deserve this, she whispered against Claire's shoulder. You deserved so much better than what our son gave you. I know, Claire said simply, and the quiet confidence in those two words seemed to give Patricia comfort, seemed to reassure her that Claire would be okay, that she was strong enough to survive this and build something better from the ruins. Marcus paused at the threshold of the dining room, turning back to look at his wife one last time. He seemed like he was trying to formulate something, an apology, an explanation, a plea for mercy, but nothing came out. What could he possibly say that would change anything? What words existed that could undo spitting on someone, could erase the contempt he'd shown, could repair trust so thoroughly shattered? I loved you, he finally said, his voice breaking. I know you don't believe me, but I did. I do. Claire looked at him steadily, her face showing no emotion. No, she said quietly. You loved the idea of me. You loved having a wife who was beautiful and successful and could make you look good at company events. You loved my money and my connections and what I could do for you. But you never loved me, Marcus. If you had, you wouldn't have been able to do what you did tonight. Love doesn't spit. Love doesn't humiliate. Love doesn't plot financial ruin while lying beside someone at night. 3 months passed like water through cupped hands, simultaneously too fast and too slow, each day bleeding into the next as Claire rebuilt her life from the foundation up. The divorce had been finalized within 6 weeks. Marcus's signature, a defeated scrawl on papers that dissolved 8 years of marriage into legal terminology and property divisions. He got nothing, just as Claire had promised. The prenup's infidelity clause, ironclad enough that his lawyers had advised him not to bother fighting it. Jessica had been arrested exactly 28 days after the dinner, led out of her apartment in handcuffs while news cameras caught every moment, her face twisted with rage and disbelief as if she genuinely thought wealth and privilege belonged only to people like Claire and couldn't reach down to punish people like her. Claire sat in her office at Donovan Holdings headquarters, a corner suite on the 42nd floor, with windows that overlooked the city like a queen surveying her kingdom. The space was modern and minimalist, all clean lines and neutral colors, so different from the warm, traditional style of the house she'd shared with Marcus. The house she'd sold 2 months ago because every room held ghosts she didn't want to live with anymore. Her new penthouse apartment was smaller, but entirely hers, decorated exactly how she wanted without compromise or committee, and waking up there felt like breathing clean air after years of slowly suffocating. Her assistant knocked and entered, carrying a folder marked with the Riverside Medical Center logo. The final plans for the Hensley wing, she said, setting it on Claire's desk. The board approved everything unanimously, Groundbreaking is scheduled for April 15th. Claire opened the folder and studied the architectural renderings, the proposed layout for the new pediatric wing that would bear Donald and Patricia's name. It would be state-of-the-art, equipped with the latest technology, designed with input from child psychologists to make the space less frightening for young patients. There would be a garden on the third floor, a play area that didn't look like a hospital, rooms painted in warm colors with murals of forests and oceans and outer space. It would serve thousands of children over its lifetime, would save lives and ease suffering, and it would stand as a testament to two people who'd spent their entire careers caring for others. Donald and Patricia had cried when Claire told them about the wing, had tried to refuse the honor because they felt unworthy, but she'd insisted. "You gave your lives to that hospital," she told them. "You deserve to be remembered for it." What she didn't tell them was that the wing was also her way of holding on to something good from her marriage, of preserving the connection to two people who treated her with more genuine love than her own parents ever had. Her phone buzzed with a text from Patricia. "Lunch next week. Donald wants to show you pictures of the cruise we're planning." Claire smiled and typed back a confirmation. They'd stayed close after the divorce, despite the awkwardness, despite Marcus being their son. They called her every week, invited her to dinners, treated her exactly the same as they always had. Donald had even told her, voice gruff with emotion, that she was still their daughter as far as they were concerned, that what Marcus had done didn't change how they felt about her. She thought about Marcus sometimes, usually late at night, when insomnia and memory conspired to keep her awake. She'd heard through mutual acquaintances that he'd moved to Arizona, taken a job with a small accounting firm for half the salary he'd made before, was living in a one-bedroom apartment and driving a car that was more rust than metal. Jessica had been sentenced to 3 years in prison, her nursing license permanently revoked, her entire future collapsed like a building with a faulty foundation. Claire felt no satisfaction in their downfall, no triumph or vindication, just a kind of empty exhaustion that came from having to destroy people she'd once cared about. Her therapist had told her that grief and anger could coexist, that she was allowed to mourn the marriage she'd thought she had, while also being furious about the betrayal. Claire was working on that, working on letting herself feel things fully instead of hiding behind composure and control. She'd spent so many years being Claire Donovan, heir to a fortune and a legacy, always composed, always appropriate, that she'd forgotten how to just be Claire, a woman with hopes and fears and wounds that needed time to heal. The intercom buzzed. "Miss Donovan, your 3 o'clock is here. Representatives from the Children's Medical Research Foundation." Claire gathered her papers and stood, smoothing her skirt, slipping back into the role of CEO and philanthropist and powerful woman who controlled more money than most people would see in 10 lifetimes. But before she left her office, she paused at the window, looking out at the city spread below her like a promise. Somewhere down there, Donald was probably at the hospital volunteering despite his retirement, unable to stay away from the work he loved. Patricia was likely at the community center where she taught knitting to seniors, creating beauty and connection with needle and yarn. And Marcus was in Arizona, living with the consequences of his choices, learning the hard way that some bridges, once burned, left you stranded on the wrong side of a canyon you could never cross again. The charity gala that evening was at the Riverside Grand Hotel, a glittering affair with champagne fountains and an orchestra, and 600 of the city's wealthiest residents pretending to care about causes they'd forget by morning. Claire wore a navy gown that cost more than some people's cars, her grandmother's diamonds at her throat, and moved through the crowd with practiced ease, shaking hands and making small talk, and writing checks that would fund research and programs and save lives. She was standing by the bar, waiting for a glass of water, when she saw him. Marcus across the room, looking thinner and older than he had just 3 months ago, like someone had taken an eraser to the edges of who he used to be. He was alone, wearing a suit that didn't fit quite right, and he was staring at her with an expression that managed to be both desperate and resigned. Their eyes met across the crowded ballroom, and Claire saw everything in that glance. Regret, shame, the desperate wish that time could reverse itself and give him a chance to make different choices. She saw the man he might have been if he'd chosen differently, if he'd valued what he had instead of resenting what he didn't. For a moment, something flickered in her chest that might have been pity or might have been the ghost of love she'd once felt. But then it passed, replaced by simple acceptance. She raised her water glass slightly, a gesture that could have been acknowledgement or farewell or both. And then she turned away. Because that was the thing about crushing someone. Claire had learned through therapy and sleepless nights and the slow, painful process of healing. It wasn't about rage or revenge or making them suffer, though she'd certainly done that. It was about showing them, with perfect clarity, exactly what they'd thrown away. It was about standing in your truth and letting that truth be so bright, so undeniable, that everyone who looked at it had to either embrace it or turn away in shame. And Marcus, for all his faults and failures, had enough self-awareness left to know that he'd had something precious and destroyed it with his own hands. He'd had a woman who loved him, parents who respected him, a comfortable life built on genuine foundations, and he'd traded it all for momentary excitement and ego gratification. Now he stood alone in a ballroom full of people who knew his story, who knew what he'd done, and he couldn't even afford the price of admission except as someone's awkward plus one. As Claire walked out of the gala that night, into the spring air that smelled like rain and new beginnings, she thought about the woman she'd been at that dinner table 3 months ago, with spit on her face and her husband's mistress laughing. That woman was gone now, not because she'd been broken, but because she'd been forged into something stronger, something that knew its own worth and wouldn't settle for less ever again. She'd learned that kindness wasn't weakness, that choosing peace didn't mean accepting disrespect, and that sometimes the most powerful thing you could do was walk away from people who didn't deserve you and build a life so beautiful they'd spend the rest of their existence regretting what they lost. The hospital expansion broke ground that spring, and Claire attended the ceremony with Donald and Patricia, who stood on either side of her like the parents she'd never had. They cut the ribbon together, the three of them, and when the photographer asked them to smile, Claire did, and it was real. The Hensley wing would open in 18 months, would serve the community for generations, would stand as proof that some legacies were worth building and some people were worth honoring. And somewhere in Arizona, Marcus would read about it online, would see the pictures of his parents standing with his ex-wife, would understand fully and finally that he'd been given something remarkable and had destroyed it through his own cruelty and short-sightedness. That understanding wouldn't change anything, wouldn't undo the damage or repair what he'd broken, but it would haunt him for the rest of his life, a ghost that followed him through every mediocre job and every failed relationship, and every moment when he wondered what his life might have been if he'd made different choices. Claire drove home that night to her penthouse with its floor-to-ceiling windows and its view of the city lights. And for the first time in 8 years, she felt completely at peace. She wasn't the woman who'd been spat on anymore, wasn't the wife who'd been betrayed and humiliated. She was Claire Donovan, and she was enough, and the future stretched before her like an open road with no map needed because she finally trusted herself to find her own way.